Sometimes the smallest creatures find us when we need them most. In the forgotten Wyoming town, a weathered cowhand with empty pockets discovers that love comes when we're broken enough to let it in. Callie Monroe has been drifting for years now, carrying loss like stones in her saddlebag. When she finds a puppy tied to a bench outside an abandoned post office, she can't afford another mouth to feed. But those eyes won't let her walk away. As Callie searches for who left the pup, she stumbles into secrets deeper than imagined. What begins as a burden becomes something unexpected, a second chance. But what truth made someone abandon an innocent soul in this quiet town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Ashford sat at the edge of nothing, where the Wyoming plains rolled into foothills that promised mountains but never quite delivered. It was the kind of place that people passed through on their way to somewhere better, and those who stayed did so because leaving required more energy than they had left to give. The main street ran 3 blocks long, lined with buildings that had once been painted cheerful colors, but now wore the faded gray-brown of weathered wood and peeling paint. Most of the storefronts stood empty, their windows dusty and cracked, displaying nothing but shadows and the occasional bird's nest. Callie Monroe had arrived in Ashford 2 days ago with $17 in her pocket, a horse that wasn't technically hers, and a saddle that had seen better decades. She was 38 years old, though the sun and wind had carved lines around her eyes that made her look older. Her hands were calloused and strong, her shoulders broad from years of ranch work, and her hair, once the color of wheat fields in August, hung in a braid down her back, threaded with premature gray. She wore men's work clothes because they lasted longer and fit better for the kind of labor she did. And her boots had been resoled so many times, the leather had taken on the character of a well-loved book. Creased and softened by use, she'd been drifting for 3 years now, ever since the ranch in Montana had let her go. Before that, she'd worked at a spread outside of Billings for 2 seasons. And before that, a small horse farm in Idaho. The work was always the same: mending fences, feeding livestock, mucking stalls, breaking horses when they needed breaking. She was good at it, reliable and quiet, the kind of hand who showed up before dawn and didn't complain when the work ran past dark. But ranches were struggling, and permanent positions were rare. Most places hired on for a season and let you go when the money ran thin or the work slowed down. Callie had learned not to get attached to any one place, any one bunkhouse, any one set of faces around the dinner table. The horse, a bay gelding named Rusty, technically belonged to the last ranch she'd worked at, but the owner had told her to take him when she left. "Better you have him than he ends up at auction," the man had said, not quite meeting her eyes. It was charity disguised as practicality, and Callie had accepted it with a nod and no words, because words would have required her to acknowledge the kindness. And acknowledging kindness made her throat tight. She'd been sleeping in Rusty's stall at the livery stable on the edge of Ashford, paying 50 cents a night to the boy who ran the place. His name was Tommy, and he couldn't have been more than 15, with a shock of red hair and a nervous habit of tugging at his collar. He'd asked her twice if she was planning to stay, and both times she'd told him she didn't know yet. The truth was, she had nowhere else to go and no money to get there. But admitting that felt like defeat. The post office sat on the corner of Main and 2nd. A squat brick building with a sagging porch and a faded sign that still read U.S. Mail in letters that had once been gold. It had been closed for a year, maybe longer. Tommy said the town didn't have enough people left to justify keeping it open. The mail came once a week now, sorted at the general store by whoever happened to be working that day. The bench out front was old oak, the kind that had been built to last, with deep grooves worn into the seat from decades of people waiting for letters that would change their lives or break their hearts. That's where Callie found her. The puppy couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old. A scruffy little thing with fur, the color of dry prairie grass, and eyes too big for her face. Someone had tied her to the bench with a piece of twine, not even rope. Just kitchen twine, the kind you'd use to truss a chicken. The knot was clumsy, loose enough that the puppy had managed to tangle herself around the bench leg. And when Callie approached, the little thing started shaking so hard, her whole body vibrated. Callie stopped a few feet away, hands hanging loose at her sides. She'd learned a long time ago that the best way to approach a frightened animal was to make yourself small, unthreatening. She crouched down, her knees protesting the movement, and waited. The puppy watched her with those enormous eyes, brown and liquid, and full of a terror that made Callie's chest ache. There was a small bowl next to the bench, empty except for a few drops of water that had dried to mineral stains. No food, no blanket. Just the puppy and the twine and the empty bowl. "Hey there, little one," Callie said quietly. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, scratched raw from disuse. She didn't talk much these days. There was no one to talk to. "You doing okay?" The puppy whimpered, a sound so small and pitiful that Callie felt something crack open inside her chest, something she'd kept carefully sealed for a long time now. She recognized that sound. She'd made it herself once, though not out loud. It was the sound of being left behind. She moved slowly, inching closer on her heels, until she was near enough to touch. The puppy pressed herself against the bench leg, trying to make herself smaller, but she didn't snap or growl, just trembled and watched with those heartbreaking eyes. Callie reached out and gently untangled the twine from around the bench leg, her fingers working the knot loose with the patience of someone who'd spent years working with frightened horses. The puppy's fur was matted and dirty, and she was thin enough that Callie could feel every rib beneath the scruffy coat. "Someone left you here," Callie said, more to herself than to the dog. "Just tied you up and walked away." The puppy leaned into her hand just slightly, and that small gesture of trust hit Callie harder than she expected. She'd been alone for so long now, had worked so hard to keep everyone and everything at arm's length, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed. To have another living creature look at you like you might be the answer to something. She sat down on the bench, the puppy now free but still close, and looked out at the empty street. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the buildings in shades of amber and gold. A few people moved along the sidewalk, an older woman carrying a basket, a man in a worn suit walking with his head down. No one looked at her. No one seemed to notice the puppy at all. Callie thought about her brother Thomas. He'd been younger by 2 years, quick to laugh and slow to anger, the kind of person who made friends everywhere he went. He'd loved animals, especially dogs. When they were kids growing up on their parents' small ranch outside of Casper, Thomas had collected strays the way other children collected rocks or marbles. He'd bring them home with those same pleading eyes, and their mother would sigh and find room for one more mouth to feed. Thomas had died 6 years ago in a riding accident. A green horse had spooked at nothing, thrown him badly. He'd hit his head on a fence post and never woken up. Callie had been the one to find him. And the memory of that moment, the unnatural angle of his neck, the blood in his sandy hair, the absolute stillness of him, lived in her chest like a stone she carried everywhere. After Thomas died, their parents had sold the ranch and moved to Arizona to live with Callie's aunt. They'd asked her to come, but Callie couldn't imagine herself in Arizona, in some retirement community where everyone played cards and talked about their grandchildren. She'd stayed in Wyoming, taking whatever work she could find, moving from ranch to ranch, season to season. Her parents called sometimes, left messages at general stores or with ranch managers, but Callie rarely called back. What would she say? That she was fine, that she was managing. Both would be lies, and she was too tired to lie. The puppy pressed against her leg, still shaking but seeking comfort, and Callie felt the weight of decision settling over her shoulders. She had $17. She needed at least 5 of that for another week at the livery, and the rest would barely cover food for herself, let alone a dog. She had no idea where her next job would come from. She'd asked at the 2 remaining ranches near Ashford, and both had told her they weren't hiring. Winter was coming, and she needed to move on soon. Find work somewhere before the snow made travel impossible. Taking in a stray puppy was the kind of foolish, impractical thing that Thomas would have done without hesitation. It was exactly the kind of decision that led to complications, to attachment, to the possibility of more loss. But those eyes. Callie looked down at the puppy, who looked back with an expression that seemed to say, "Please, please don't leave me too." She thought about Thomas finding that three-legged cat when he was 12, carrying it home in his jacket despite the fact that it hissed and scratched him bloody. "She's scared," he'd told Callie, unbothered by the welts rising on his arms. "We can't just leave her out there to die." The cat, they'd named her Lucky, with the irony that only children can muster, had lived another 8 years, becoming the most pampered creature on the ranch. She'd slept on Thomas's bed every night, purring loud enough to hear from the next room. Callie reached down and picked up the puppy, who fit easily in her 2 hands. The little thing weighed hardly anything, all bones and trembling and desperate trust. She tucked the pup inside her jacket, feeling the rapid heartbeat against her ribs. "All right," she said quietly, standing up from the bench. "Let's figure this out." She walked back toward the livery stable, the puppy warm against her chest. Tommy was in the barn, forking hay into a stall, and he looked up when she entered. "Found this one tied to the bench at the post office," Callie said. "You know anything about it?" Tommy set down the pitchfork and came closer, wiping his hands on his pants. His face shifted into something sad when he saw the puppy. "That's the 3rd one this month," he said. "People can't afford to keep them, so they just leave them places and hope someone else will take them." "3rd one?" Callie felt a cold anger settling in her stomach. "Yeah. Old Mrs. Henderson found one tied to the church steps, and before that, someone left one in a box behind the general store. Most of them don't make it." He reached out and gently scratched the puppy's head. "This one's lucky you found her." Callie didn't feel lucky. She felt trapped by a pair of brown eyes, and the memory of her brother's voice saying, "We can't just leave her out there to die." "I need to find who left her," Callie said. "Someone in this town knows something," Tommy shrugged. "Maybe, but people don't like to admit to things like that. Makes them feel guilty." Callie looked down at the puppy, who had stopped shaking and was now looking around with cautious curiosity. "I can't keep her," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I don't have the money." "Martha at the general store might know something," Tommy offered. "She knows everyone's business. If someone's been giving away puppies, she'd have heard about it." Callie nodded slowly. "The general store stayed open until 6. She had time. Can you watch her for an hour?" Callie asked. "I need to ask around." Tommy grinned, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Sure thing." "I got some scraps from dinner I can give her." Callie handed over the puppy with more reluctance than she wanted to admit, then headed back out into the fading light. The town felt different now, seen through the lens of someone who would abandon a helpless creature on a bench. She looked at the quiet houses, the closed shops, the empty streets, and wondered what other secrets Ashford was keeping. The general store occupied the largest building on Main Street, a 2-story structure with a false front that made it look grander than it was. A bell chimed when Callie pushed through the door, and the smell hit her immediately. Coffee and dried herbs, leather and tobacco. The particular mustiness of a place that sold everything from canned goods to work gloves. Martha Cunningham stood behind the counter. A woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She looked up from the ledger she was writing in and studied Callie with the frank appraisal of someone who'd seen enough of life to make quick judgments. "You're the one staying at Tommy's place," Martha said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Callie said. "I'm looking for information about a puppy someone left tied to the post office bench. Tommy said you might know something." Martha's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a wariness or maybe resignation. She set down her pen with deliberate care. "That would be the Pritchard pup," she said. "Whole litter of them. 6 puppies and the mother too sick to feed them properly." "Who are the Pritchards?" "Family that owns the farm about 3 miles north of here. Daniel and Sarah Pritchard, their daughter Emma. Good people, but they're struggling. Martha picked up a cloth and started wiping down the already clean counter. Daniel broke his leg back in spring. Couldn't work for 3 months. They're behind on everything. Mortgage, feed bills, doctor's bills. Sarah's been taking in washing to try to keep up, but it's not enough. Callie felt her anger cooling into something more complicated. So they're just abandoning the puppies. What would you have them do? Martha's voice was sharp now, defensive. They can't afford to feed them. Can't afford to take them to a shelter. Nearest one's 40 miles away and charges a surrender fee. They're hoping someone will take them in, give them a chance. It's not cruel, it's desperate. Callie thought about the puppies shaking on that bench, thought about the empty water bowl and the cheap twine. It feels cruel. Well, Martha set down the cloth. Maybe you ought to go talk to them before you judge. See what desperation looks like up close. The words hit harder than Callie expected. She'd been desperate herself not so long ago, had made choices that seemed impossible at the time. Who was she to stand in judgment? Where exactly is their farm? Callie asked quietly. Martha gave her directions. Follow the north road past the old cemetery, turn at the lightning-struck oak, watch for the mailbox with the faded blue flowers painted on it. But don't go expecting them to thank you for showing up, Martha added. They're proud people. This whole situation is killing them. Callie thanked her and left, the bell chiming behind her like a small accusation. The sun had dropped below the horizon now, and the air had taken on the sharp chill that came with high desert evenings. She walked back to the livery, her mind working through the new information. Tommy had the puppy wrapped in an old blanket in one of the empty stalls. The little thing had eaten scraps of meat and was now sleeping, her small body rising and falling with quick breaths. Tommy looked up when Callie entered, hope bright on his young face. You keeping her? I don't know yet, Callie said. She knelt down next to the sleeping puppy, reached out to touch the soft fur. I need to talk to the family that left her first. The Pritchards? Tommy's expression shifted. Yeah, Emma, that's their daughter. She's been real torn up about it. She's in my grade at school. Said her pa told her they had to get rid of the dogs or they wouldn't make it through winter. Callie felt something tight in her chest. A child forced to give up her pets because her family was drowning. How many times had she seen this same story play out in different ways? How many families had she watched pack up and leave ranches they'd owned for generations because the math no longer worked? I'm going out there tomorrow, Callie said. Will you watch her tonight? Sure, Tommy grinned. I like having her around. Barn feels less lonely. Callie understood that feeling better than she wanted to admit. She spent the night in Rusty's stall, listening to the horse's steady breathing and the small sounds of mice in the hayloft. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams of Thomas and the three-legged cat, of her mother's face when they'd buried him, of empty benches and abandoned things. When dawn came, she saddled Rusty and rode north out of town. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of day where you could see for miles in every direction. The land rolled away in gentle waves, covered in sagebrush and dried grass, and in the distance, the mountains rose up like promises of something better. The Pritchard farm sat in a small valley, sheltered by a line of cottonwoods that had gone golden with autumn. The house was modest, white clapboard with a sagging porch and a roof that needed patching. The barn leaned slightly to one side, and the fences were held together with wire and determination. But the yard was swept clean, and someone had planted flowers around the porch that were still blooming despite the cold nights. A dog barked as Callie rode up, an older border collie that came limping out from the barn, tail wagging despite the aggressive sound. Behind the dog came a woman in her 40s, wiping her hands on her apron, her face careworn, but still pretty in the morning light. Can I help you? Sarah Pritchard's voice was cautious, but not unfriendly. Callie dismounted, leaving Rusty's reins to drag. My name's Callie Monroe. I found a puppy tied to the bench in town yesterday. Martha at the general store said she might belong to you. Sarah's face went pale, then flushed with shame. She looked away toward the barn, her hands twisting in her apron. Did you come to tell us what terrible people we are? Because I promise you, we already know. No, ma'am, Callie said quietly. I came to understand. Sarah looked back at her, eyes bright with unshed tears. My husband broke his leg. We couldn't afford the doctor, couldn't afford to be without his labor. Our daughter had to quit school to help with the work. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage, and the bank is threatening foreclosure. The dog had puppies, and we couldn't. Her voice broke. We couldn't feed them. We couldn't keep them. Emma cried for 2 days straight when we had to take them away. Callie felt the anger she'd been carrying dissolve completely, replaced by a deep, aching empathy. How many puppies were there? 6. We found homes for 3. The other 3, Sarah shook her head. We've been leaving them places where people might find them. Might give them a chance. I know it's not right. I know it makes us... She stopped, unable to finish. Where's the mother dog? Callie asked. In the barn. She's old, nearly blind. After she had the puppies, she just gave out. Can't even walk without help. Sarah wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Daniel wants to shoot her, put her out of her misery. But Emma's already lost so much. A girl appeared in the doorway of the house. She was maybe 14, thin and serious-looking, with her mother's dark hair and her father's angular features. When she saw Callie, her expression closed down, protective. Mama, she called. Everything okay? It's fine, honey, Sarah called back, but her voice was strained. Callie made a decision then, standing in that swept yard with autumn light falling golden through the cottonwoods. It was the kind of decision Thomas would have made. Impractical, potentially foolish, but necessary in a way that had nothing to do with logic. I'll take the puppy, she said. The one I found. And I'll help you find homes for the other 2. Sarah stared at her. You don't have to do that. You don't owe us anything. No, Callie agreed. But maybe I owe myself something. Maybe I've been drifting long enough. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise Sarah, but once spoken, they felt true. She'd been running from attachment, from connection, from the possibility of loss for 3 years now. And where had it gotten her? To a livery stable in a dying town with $17 and a borrowed horse. Maybe it was time to stop running. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they spilled over. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. Emma came down from the porch now, walking slowly, her eyes locked on Callie with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. You really going to keep her? She asked. Not just take her and leave her somewhere else. I'm going to keep her, Callie said, and meant it. The girl's face transformed, relief and gratitude flooding her features. Can I show you the others? The 2 we still have? Callie followed Emma to the barn, where 2 more puppies were curled up in a box of straw. They were siblings to the one Callie had found, same scruffy fur, same oversized eyes. And in the corner, lying on a pile of blankets, was the mother dog. She was ancient, her muzzle white with age, her eyes clouded with cataracts. But when Emma knelt beside her, the old dog's tail thumped weakly against the ground, and Callie saw the love that passed between girl and animal, pure and uncomplicated and absolutely real. This is Daisy, Emma said softly. She's been with us since I was little. She's the best dog in the world. Callie knelt down too, reached out to let Daisy sniff her hand. The old dog's nose was warm and dry, and when Callie scratched behind her ears, Daisy leaned into the touch with a soft sigh. Something broke open in Callie's chest then, something that had been frozen for a long time. She thought about Thomas, about Lucky the 3-legged cat, about all the times her brother had chosen kindness over practicality. She thought about the years she'd spent moving from place to place, never staying long enough to matter, never letting herself care enough to be hurt, and she thought about the puppy waiting for her back in town, the one whose eyes had seen right through her defenses to the lonely, frightened woman underneath. I'll find homes for these 2, Callie heard herself say. And if you need help with anything else, with the farm work, with your father, I'm staying in Ashford for a while. I can lend a hand. Emma looked up at her with such hope that Callie felt the weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders like a familiar yoke. But it didn't feel heavy. It felt like purpose. It felt like coming home. The puppy needed a name. Callie sat on the floor of the stable that evening, the little thing curled up in her lap, and tried to think of something that fit. She'd never been good at naming things. Thomas had always handled that, spinning stories about where the names came from until even the animals seemed to believe them. "You look like trouble," Callie murmured, running her hand over the scruffy fur. The puppy yawned, showing a pink tongue and needle-sharp teeth. "But you're brave, too." Lasted a whole day on that bench without giving up. Brave. The word stuck with her. Her grandmother had been named Bravina, shortened to Brava by everyone who knew her. She'd been a fierce woman who'd homesteaded in Montana when women didn't do such things, who'd raised 5 children mostly alone while her husband worked the railroad. Callie had loved her with the uncomplicated devotion of a child, and when Brava died, the winter Callie turned 9, she'd cried for weeks. "Brava," she said aloud, testing it. The puppy's ear twitched. "What do you think? You going to grow up fierce like her?" The puppy licked her hand, which Callie decided to take as agreement. Tommy poked his head into the stall, grinning when he saw them together. "She got a name yet?" "Brava," Callie said. "After my grandmother." "That's a good name. Strong." Tommy sat down on an overturned bucket, his red hair catching the lamplight. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by earlier. Said she might be interested in one of those other puppies, if you're still looking for homes." "That's good news," Callie said, feeling a small weight lift. "What about the third one?" "Still working on it. But I got an idea. There's a widow woman, Mrs. Fletcher, lives out on the old Miller place. Her husband died last year and she's out there all alone. Might appreciate the company." Callie nodded slowly. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Fletcher, both of them women living on the edges of things, same as her. Maybe that's who found each other in places like Ashford. The ones who'd been left behind or had chosen to stay when everyone else moved on. "I'll talk to her," Callie said. "And I need to find work. Can't keep paying for this stall if I'm not earning." Tommy's expression turned thoughtful. "You any good with building?" "The church roof's been leaking for 6 months. Reverend Michaels has been trying to patch it himself, but he's 70-something and shouldn't be on a ladder." "I can handle a roof," Callie said. Ranch work had taught her a bit of everything. Carpentry, masonry, basic plumbing. You didn't survive in remote places without learning to fix what broke. "Who do I talk to?" "Just show up Sunday." Reverend's always there after service working on something. That gave Callie 3 days. 3 days to settle Brava, find homes for the other puppies, and figure out what staying in Ashford actually meant. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as temporary, as someone just passing through, that the idea of remaining somewhere felt foreign and slightly dangerous. That night, Brava slept curled against Callie's stomach, her small body warm and trusting. Callie lay awake, listening to Rusty shift in his stall, and the wind rattling the barn boards. She thought about the Pritchard farm, about Emma's face when she'd promised to help, about the old mother dog lying on her pile of blankets with clouded eyes and a still wagging tail. She thought about Thomas telling her once, after their father had yelled at him for bringing home yet another stray, "Someone has to care about the things nobody else wants. Otherwise, what's the point of any of it?" At the time, Callie had been 16 and practical and thought her brother was being naive. Now, at 38 with nothing to her name but a borrowed horse and a found puppy, she was starting to understand what he'd meant. The next morning, she rode out to the Pritchard farm again. Sarah was in the yard, taking down laundry that had frozen stiff on the line overnight. She looked surprised to see Callie, but not displeased. "Mrs. Pritchard," Callie said, dismounting. "I was thinking I could help out around here today. Pay you back for taking Brava." "You don't owe us anything," Sarah said, but her eyes were hopeful. "Daniel's still laid up and there's work piling up faster than Emma and I can handle it. Then let me help. I'm good with my hands and I've got nothing else pressing." Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "The fence in the west pasture needs mending. Wires come loose in 3 places and we can't let the cattle wander. Emma can show you where the tools are." Emma appeared from the barn carrying a bucket of feed, her face lighting up when she saw Callie. "You came back." "Said I would," Callie replied. "Going to fix your fence." The girl set down the bucket and led Callie to a shed behind the barn, where tools hung on nails driven into the walls with no particular organization. Wire cutters, fence pliers, a hammer, rolls of barbed wire. Everything Callie needed. "Can I come with you?" Emma asked. I'm supposed to be doing schoolwork, but I'm way ahead anyway. And I'm better at holding fence posts than Mama is." Callie looked at the girl's eager face and remembered being that age, desperate to be useful, to prove she was strong enough for the hard work. "Sure, grab some gloves." They worked together in companionable silence, Callie teaching Emma the proper way to stretch wire and secure it to posts. The girl was strong for her size and didn't complain when the work was hard or when the wire bit into her gloves. She reminded Callie of herself at that age, determined to keep up, to not be left behind because she was young or female. "My pa says we might lose the farm," Emma said after a while, her voice careful. "Says the bank's going to take it if we can't catch up on payments." Callie pulled the wire tight and hammered in another staple. "How far behind are you?" 3 months. Maybe 4 now. I don't know exactly. Pa won't talk about it in front of me, but I hear him and Mama at night. She cries a lot." Emma's hand stilled on the post she was holding. "If we lose the farm, where will we go? This is the only home I've ever known." The question hung in the cold morning air. Callie didn't have an answer because she'd been asking herself similar questions for 3 years now. Where do you go when the only home you've known disappears? What do you hold on to when everything solid turns to sand? "Sometimes things work out in ways we don't expect," Callie said finally, inadequately. "Sometimes help comes from places we didn't know to look." Emma nodded, but she didn't look convinced. At 14, she was old enough to understand that hope wasn't the same as a solution. They finished the fence by midday, and Sarah insisted Callie stay for lunch. The meal was simple: bread and cheese, apples from a tree in the yard, but it was shared with a warmth that made Callie's throat tight. Daniel Pritchard sat at the table with his leg propped on a chair. A thin man with work-roughened hands and eyes that held the particular weariness of someone watching everything he'd built slip away. "Thank you for helping," he said to Callie, his voice gruff with pride that struggled against gratitude. "Don't have money to pay you, but we appreciate it." "Don't want money," Callie said. "Just paying forward some kindness I've been shown." After lunch, she rode back into town, with the 2 remaining puppies in a sack tied to her saddle. They squirmed and whimpered, and Brava, who she'd brought along tucked in her jacket, poked her head out to look at them with what seemed like concern. Mrs. Henderson lived in a tidy house near the church, and when Callie knocked on her door, holding one of the puppies, the older woman's face softened immediately. "Oh, my," she said, reaching out to take the puppy. "Isn't she precious?" "She needs a home," Callie said simply. "Thought you might have room." Mrs. Henderson held the puppy close, and Callie saw something ease in the woman's expression, a loneliness recognized and addressed. "I've been so quiet since George passed." "Yes, I think I have room. 1 down, 1 to go." Mrs. Fletcher's place was 3 miles out of town, down a rutted track that tested Rusty's sure-footedness. The house was small and weathered, but smoke rose from the chimney, and chickens scratched in the yard. When Callie knocked, a woman answered with a shotgun in her hands and suspicion in her eyes. "Mrs. Fletcher?" Callie said carefully, keeping her hands visible. "Tommy at the livery said you might be interested in a dog. For company." The woman was maybe 60, lean and hard-looking, with grey hair pulled back and eyes that had seen more than their share of trouble. She looked at Callie, then at the puppy poking out of the sack, and something in her face shifted. "Just me out here," she said. "Could use something to talk to besides chickens." She lowered the shotgun, and Callie let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. By the time Callie rode back to town, all 3 puppies had homes, and she felt lighter than she had in months, maybe years. It wasn't much, 3 dogs placed with 3 lonely people in a struggling town, but it was something. It was connection where there had been isolation. It was care where there had been abandonment. It was exactly the kind of thing Thomas would have done, and for the first time since his death, thinking about him didn't just hurt. It felt like guidance, like maybe he was still teaching her how to live, even from wherever he'd gone. Brava slept against her chest as Rusty carried them home through the gathering dusk, and Callie thought about Sunday, about the church roof, about the possibility of staying. Sunday came cold and bright. Callie hadn't been inside a church in years. not since Thomas's funeral, where she'd sat in the front pew next to her parents and felt nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness. But this wasn't about faith or prayer or whatever people came to church seeking. This was about a roof that needed fixing and a way to earn her keep in a town that had started to feel less temporary than she'd planned. The Ashford Community Church was a simple white building with a steeple that leaned slightly west, as if it too was tired of standing straight. Callie arrived after the service had let out, when most folks had gone home for Sunday dinner. Reverend Michaels was on a ladder propped against the side of the building, a bucket of tar in one hand and a face full of frustration. "Reverend," Callie called up. "Tommy said you might need help with that roof." The old man looked down, squinting in the sunlight. He was small and wiry, with a shock of white hair and hands that trembled slightly as they gripped the ladder. "You know anything about roofing?" "Enough to keep the rain out," Callie said. "More than enough to do a better job than you're managing from that ladder." He laughed, a dry sound but genuine. "Fair point. Come on up then, if you're serious." They worked together for the better part of the afternoon, Callie doing the heavy lifting while Reverend Michaels pointed out trouble spots and told stories about the church's history. It had been built in 1887, he said, by miners who'd struck silver in the hills and wanted to thank God for their good fortune. The silver had run out within 5 years, but the church remained. Most things outlast the reasons they were built, he said, watching Callie hammer down a new shingle. A church's townspeople's faith. We just keep going because stopping seems worse than continuing. Callie thought about that while she worked. Was that what she'd been doing these past 3 years? Just continuing, because stopping would mean facing everything she'd lost. Moving from place to place wasn't living. It was just not dying, which wasn't the same thing at all. "What brings you to Ashford?" the Reverend asked. "You don't seem like someone planning to settle." "Wasn't planning to," Callie admitted. She secured another shingle, the rhythm of the work soothing. "But I found a puppy that needed help, and helping her led to helping some other folks, and now I'm on a church roof on a Sunday afternoon. Life's funny that way." "Funny's one word for it," he agreed. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, is what we say in my line of work. But between you and me, I think it's just that kindness has a way of spreading if you let it. One good deed leads to another, and before you know it, you're part of something bigger than yourself." Brava was tied to the church fence below, and when Callie looked down, the puppy was chewing on a stick 3 times her size with fierce determination. The sight made her smile, something warm spreading through her chest. They finished just as the sun started its descent toward the horizon. Reverend Michaels paid her $5 from the collection plate over her protests. "A worker's worthy of her wage," he said firmly. "And you did good work. If you're staying around, we could use someone with your skills. Building's old, always something needs fixing, $5. Added to what she had left, it gave her breathing room. Not much, but enough to keep paying Tommy and buy food for herself and Brava. Enough to stay a little longer. That evening, she walked to the general store before it closed. Martha was sweeping the floor, her movements efficient and practiced. "Heard you fixed the church roof," Martha said without looking up. Reverend was pleased. "Word travels fast in a small town," Callie observed. "Only thing that does travel fast around here." Martha leaned on her broom, studying Callie with those sharp eyes. "You planning to stick around, or are you just passing through like all the others?" It was the same question everyone kept asking, and Callie still didn't have a solid answer. "Don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I'm not in a hurry to leave." "Good. Town could use someone with a little grit left in them. Too many folks have given up, just waiting for Ashford to die so they can bury it and move on." Martha went back to sweeping. "If you're looking for more work, talk to Harold Brennan. He owns the lumber yard, such as it is. He's getting on in years and could use help with deliveries." Callie bought cornmeal and dried beans, careful with her money, and walked back to the livery through the gathering dark. The town felt different now that she knew more people, now that faces were attached to names and stories. It felt less like a place she was passing through and more like a place she might belong. Tommy was in the barn, and when Callie entered, She found him sitting in Rusty's stall with Brava curled up in his lap. "Hope you don't mind," he said quickly. "She was crying and I thought maybe she was lonely." "Don't mind at all," Callie said, settling down beside him. Brava immediately abandoned Tommy to climb into Callie's lap, her small tail wagging so hard her whole body wiggled. "You're good with her." "I like dogs," Tommy said. "We used to have one before my pa left and my ma got sick. Had to give him away when we couldn't afford to keep him." Callie heard the echo of Emma's story, of the Pritchard's struggle, of everyone in this town trying to hold on to something that kept slipping through their fingers. "What happened to your mother?" she asked gently. "She died 2 years ago, consumption. I've been running this place since, but it's not really mine. Belongs to Mr. Garrett, who lives over in Cheyenne. He lets me manage it, takes most of the profits. I get enough to eat and a place to sleep, but that's about it. 15 years old, and already shouldering a man's responsibility." Callie felt a surge of anger at a world that did this to children, that took away their parents and their childhoods and expected them to just keep going. "You got any other family?" she asked. "An aunt in Denver. She wanted me to come live with her, but I didn't want to leave. This is home, you know, even if it's not much." Callie understood that better than she could say. Home wasn't always about the place. Sometimes it was about refusing to let go of the last thing that connected you to the people you'd lost. They sat in comfortable silence while Brava fell asleep between them, her small body twitching with puppy dreams. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn door and whistling through gaps in the boards. "You think the Pritchards are going to lose their farm?" Tommy asked after a while. "I don't know," Callie admitted, "but I'm going to try to help them if I can." "How? You got money hidden somewhere?" She almost laughed. "No, but maybe there's other ways to help besides money. Maybe if enough people chip in a little, it adds up to something." Tommy looked doubtful but didn't argue. At 15, he'd probably already learned that good intentions didn't pay mortgages, but Callie had been thinking about it since lunch at the Pritchard farm. Daniel couldn't work with his leg broken, but there was still work that needed doing, work that might earn a little money if someone could organize it. Fences to mend, livestock to tend, a roof that probably leaked same as the church. If she could get a few people together, maybe they could help the Pritchards catch up enough to buy some time. It was a long shot, probably foolish, definitely more involvement than she'd planned when she'd ridden into Ashford with $17 and no plans beyond the next meal. But Brava was warm in her lap, and Tommy was looking at her like she might actually be able to make a difference. And for the first time in 3 years, Callie felt like maybe she could. The next morning she rode out to the lumber yard. Harold Brennan was exactly what Martha had described, an older man, maybe 70, with hands gnarled by arthritis and a back that didn't straighten all the way anymore. He looked at Callie with open skepticism when she asked about work. "You ever driven a wagon?" he asked. "Many times," Callie said. "Ranch work. I can handle a team. It's not easy work. Heavy lifting, long days. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Brennan, and I need the wages." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. $3 a day, 6 days a week. You start tomorrow, $18 a week." It was more than she'd made at some of the ranches, enough to pay Tommy, feed herself and Brava, and maybe save a little. Enough to stay. "Thank you, sir," Callie said. She rode back into town, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just relief, but anticipation. Tomorrow she'd start at the lumber yard. Sunday she'd work on the church again. And in between, she'd figure out how to help the Pritchards. She stopped by Martha's store and bought a collar for Brava, red leather, soft and sturdy. When she buckled it around the puppy's neck, Brava looked up at her with those enormous eyes, and Callie felt the last of her resistance crumble. She wasn't just passing through anymore. She was staying. And for the first time since Thomas died, that didn't terrify her. It felt right, like maybe this scruffy puppy and this struggling town were exactly what she needed to find her way back to living instead of just surviving. That night, she wrote a letter to her parents. The first one in over a year. She kept it simple, told them where she was, that she'd found work, that she had a dog now. She didn't tell them about Thomas's grave, which she still couldn't bring herself to visit. Didn't tell them about the 3 years of drifting or the loneliness that had become so familiar. She barely noticed it anymore. But she told them she might be staying somewhere for a while. And for now, that felt like enough. The work at the lumberyard was exactly as hard as Harold Brennan had promised. Callie spent her days loading wagons with fence posts and boards, driving deliveries to ranches and construction sites scattered across the territory, then unloading everything by hand. Her shoulders ached, her back protested, and by the end of each day, she barely had energy to eat before collapsing into sleep. But the work was honest, and Harold was fair. He paid her at the end of each week in cash, counting out the bills with his twisted fingers. And he never questioned her ability to do the job after that first day when she'd loaded a full wagon faster than his previous helper. Brava grew quickly, her legs lengthening and her puppy fat giving way to lean muscle. She accompanied Callie everywhere, riding in the wagon during deliveries, sleeping at her feet while she worked. The puppy had a fierce intelligence and learned quickly, sit, stay, come. She was gentle with the horses and bold with strangers, barking warnings when anyone approached the wagon, but wagging her tail once Callie gave the all-clear. That's going to be a good dog, Harold observed one afternoon, watching Brava alert to a rider approaching from the east. Smart and loyal. Those are the two things that matter most. Callie had started spending her Sundays at the Pritchard farm after finishing work at the church. She'd mend fences, repair tools, split firewood for winter, whatever needed doing. Sarah always insisted she stay for lunch, and slowly, Callie found herself looking forward to those meals around the scarred kitchen table, listening to Emma talk about school, and Daniel discuss the weather with the careful attention of someone whose livelihood depended on rain and sun. Emma had taken to following Callie around during these visits, asking questions about ranch work, about horses, about places Callie had been. The girl was hungry for something beyond the farm's borders, hungry for possibilities her current circumstances didn't allow. Did you always want to be a cowhand? Emma asked one Sunday while they were replacing boards in the barn wall. No, Callie said honestly. When I was your age, I wanted to be a teacher. Thought I'd go to normal school, come back and teach at the little schoolhouse near our ranch. What happened? My brother died. My parents sold the ranch. Everything changed, and teaching seemed like something from someone else's life. Callie hammered in a nail, the sound echoing in the barn. Sometimes life takes you down roads you didn't plan on traveling. Do you regret it? Emma's voice was careful. Not becoming a teacher. Callie thought about that. 3 weeks ago, she would have said yes. Would have listed all the ways her life had gone wrong, all the things she'd lost. But standing in this barn, with this earnest girl who reminded her of herself, with Brava sleeping in a sunny patch nearby, she found the answer wasn't as simple as she'd thought. I don't know anymore, she said. Maybe everything had to happen exactly the way it did to get me here right now. And right now doesn't feel so bad. Emma smiled at that, a real smile that lit up her whole face, and Callie felt something warm in her chest. But the warm feeling didn't last long. That evening, when Callie stopped by Martha's store for supplies, she found Sarah Pritchard there, her face drawn with worry. Mrs. Pritchard, Callie said. Everything all right? Sarah looked at her, then at Martha, then back at Callie. The bank sent someone out today. They're foreclosing. We have 30 days to vacate. The words hit Callie like a physical blow. 30 days? But surely there's something. We're 4 months behind now, Sarah said, her voice flat with exhaustion. We can't catch up. Even if Daniel could work tomorrow, we couldn't earn enough in 30 days to satisfy the debt. Martha set down the can of beans she'd been shelving. How much do you need? $200 for the back payments, plus another $100 for what's coming due. Sarah's laugh was bitter. Might as well be $2,000. Might as well be $1,300,000. To Callie, it was an impossible sum. To Harold Brennan or Martha or any individual in Ashford, it was probably the same. But to all of them together, what if everyone helped? Callie heard herself say, what if the whole town chipped in a little? Sarah looked at her with something between hope and pity. Why would they? We're not special. Hope the families in the county are struggling same as us, because that's what communities do, Martha said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. Because if we can't help our neighbors, what's the point of any of us being here? Over the next week, Callie found herself organizing something she'd never attempted before, a community fundraiser. She talked to Reverend Michaels, who agreed to make an announcement at Sunday service. She talked to Harold Brennan, who donated lumber for building auction items. She talked to Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Fletcher, who both pledged money and spread word among the other women in town. Tommy threw himself into the effort with the enthusiasm of youth, creating posters and hanging them in every business that was still open. The auction would be held in 2 weeks at the church, with donated items and services up for bid, and all proceeds going to save the Pritchard farm. But not everyone was supportive. Callie learned this when she approached Samuel Garrett, the banker who held the Pritchard mortgage. He was a thin man with cold eyes and a manner that suggested he'd never had to worry about where his next meal was coming from. "Miss Monroe," he said from behind his polished desk. "I understand you're organizing some kind of charity event for the Pritchards." "Yes, sir. To help them catch up on their payments. Very noble of you. But I feel obligated to point out that the Pritchards are poor business risks. Even if you raise the money, they'll just fall behind again in a few months. It's the nature of their situation." Callie felt anger rising in her throat. "So you'd rather foreclose? Take their land and put a family on the street?" "I'd rather," Garrett said coldly, "run a business based on sound financial principles, not sentiment. The bank has obligations to its investors. We can't carry loans indefinitely for people who can't pay. They can pay. They just need time. Time is money, Miss Monroe. Something you'd understand if you'd ever run a business." Callie left his office shaking with rage. She'd met men like Garrett before, men who saw everything in terms of profit and loss, who couldn't see the human cost of their decisions, men who wouldn't know compassion if it bit them. She went straight to the Pritchard farm, needing to tell them about the auction, needing to see Emma's face and remember why she was doing this. But when she arrived, she found Daniel Pritchard in the yard, leaning on a crutch, his face set with determination. "Mr. Pritchard," Callie said, dismounting, "you should be resting that leg." "Can't rest any more," he said. "Not with 30 days left. I'm going to work, leg or no leg. You'll hurt yourself worse. What does it matter?" His voice cracked. "We're losing everything anyway. Might as well go down fighting." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face tight with worry. "Daniel, please." "No." He turned to face his wife. "I'm not going to sit in that house and watch while they take it from us. I'm not going to let my daughter see her father give up." Emma was standing behind her mother, and the look on the girl's face broke Callie's heart. It was the look of a child trying to be brave while her world fell apart. "We're raising money," Callie said. "The whole town's helping. We're going to get you $300. Daniel looked at her with eyes that had seen too much disappointment to trust hope. "That's kind of you, Miss Monroe. It really is. But even if you raise the money, Garrett will just find another reason to take the farm. Men like him always do." He was probably right. Callie knew it, Sarah knew it, even Emma probably knew it. But that didn't mean they shouldn't try. That night, lying in Rusty's stall with Bravar warm against her side, Callie thought about Thomas, about the way he'd never let practicality stop him from doing what was right, about the 3-legged cat and all the other strays he'd saved, not because it made sense, but because they needed saving. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with him the night before the accident. They'd been sitting on the porch of their parents' ranch, watching lightning play across distant mountains, and Thomas had said something that stuck with her. "You know what I think, Cal? I think the world's full of people waiting for someone else to fix things. And nothing ever gets fixed that way. Sometimes you just have to be the one who tries, even if you fail, especially if you might fail, because trying matters more than succeeding." She hadn't understood what he meant then. She'd been 29 and practical and more concerned with getting ahead than with philosophical discussions about trying versus succeeding. But now, with a foreclosure notice hanging over a good family's heads and a whole town full of people who'd been beaten down by hard times, She was starting to understand. Trying mattered. Maybe it mattered most when success seemed impossible. Callie sat up, dislodging Brava, who grumbled in her sleep. She needed to talk to Reverend Michaels. She needed to make this auction bigger, better, more likely to succeed. She needed to find a way to raise $300 in 2 weeks. And then she needed to find a way to make sure the Pritchards could keep paying after that. It was impossible. It was foolish. It was exactly what Thomas would have done. And for the first time in 3 years, Callie felt like she was living instead of just surviving. It hurt more than surviving, exposed her to disappointment and loss and all the things she'd been running from. But it felt real in a way. Nothing had felt real since her brother's death. Brava woke up and licked her hand, and Callie scratched behind the puppy's ears. "You ready to save a farm?" she asked. Brava wagged her tail, because puppies are always ready for anything, and Callie took that as the sign she needed. The auction preparations consumed every spare moment Callie had. During her lunch breaks at the lumberyard, she'd sketch out plans and lists. In the evenings, she'd meet with Reverend Michaels and Martha and a growing group of townspeople who wanted to help. Tommy became her right hand, running messages and organizing donations with the tireless energy of youth. The donated items started arriving at the church within days. Mrs. Henderson contributed a quilt she'd been working on for months, intricate stitching in patterns that told stories. Harold Brennan donated enough lumber to build a small shed. Mrs. Fletcher brought jars of preserved fruit and vegetables from her garden. Others offered services. A week of washing and mending from one widow, carpentry work from a retired builder, even a home-cooked Sunday dinner from the church ladies. But Callie knew it wouldn't be enough. Even if every item sold for more than it was worth, they'd be lucky to raise $100. They needed something bigger, something that would draw people from outside Ashford. People with money to spend. What we need, Reverend Michaels said during one evening meeting, is something folks can't get anywhere else. Something worth traveling for. They sat in silence, thinking. Then Tommy spoke up, his young voice uncertain but determined. "What about a horse?" Everyone looked at him. He continued gaining confidence. People always need good horses. And if it was a really good horse, trained proper, someone might pay serious money for it. "Where would we get a horse?" Martha asked practically. Tommy looked at Callie. "Rusty!" Callie felt her stomach drop. "Rusty's not mine to sell, but you said the ranch owner gave him to you. That makes him yours, right?" Callie stopped. Technically, yes, Rusty was hers. But he was also the only thing of value she owned, the only thing that gave her mobility and independence. Without Rusty, she was as stuck in Ashford as everyone else. "You don't have to," Reverend Michaels said gently. "We'll find another way." But Callie thought about Emma's face, about Daniel trying to work on a broken leg, about Sarah crying at night while her daughter pretended not to hear. She thought about Thomas and the 3-legged cat, and every choice he'd made that put someone else's need ahead of his own comfort. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "We'll auction Rusty." The words hurt coming out, hurt more than she'd expected. Rusty had carried her faithfully for months, had never balked or complained, had been her companion through lonely days and cold nights. Selling him felt like betrayal, but keeping him while a family lost everything felt worse. The next Sunday, she rode out to the Pritchard farm one last time on Rusty's back. Emma was in the yard practicing with a rope, trying to perfect her lasso technique. She'd gotten better since Callie had started teaching her, and now she could catch a fence post 3 times out of 5. "Nice throw," Callie said, dismounting. Emma beamed. "Been practicing every day. Pa says if we keep the farm, maybe I can help with the cattle drive next spring, if we keep the farm." The words hung heavy with conditional hope. "Emma," Callie said carefully, "I need to tell you something. About the auction." They sat on the porch steps, and Callie explained about Rusty, about the decision she'd made. Emma listened with that serious expression she wore when processing difficult information. "But what will you do without a horse?" Emma asked. "How will you work?" "I'll figure something out." "I always do." "That's not fair," Emma said, her voice fierce. You shouldn't have to give up your horse for us. We're not your family. The words hit Callie unexpectedly hard. Maybe not by blood, she said slowly. But family's not just about who you're born to. Sometimes it's about who you choose. Who chooses you back? Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she threw her arms around Callie with the unself-conscious affection of youth. Callie hugged her back, thinking about all the ways this girl reminded her of Thomas. The hopefulness, the determination, the refusal to give up even when giving up made sense. The auction was set for Saturday afternoon. Word had spread beyond Ashford, carried by travellers and ranch hands, and the peculiar grapevine that existed in sparsely populated places. People were curious about the town that had come together to save one of its own, curious about what was being offered, curious enough to make the trip. Friday night, Callie couldn't sleep. She lay in the stall with Brava curled against her side, listening to Rusty shift and breathe in the next space over. Tomorrow she'd say goodbye to him. Tomorrow she'd be back to having almost nothing. No horse, no real home, just a puppy and a job and a town full of people she barely knew. But she did know them now, didn't she? She knew Martha's sharp tongue hid a soft heart, knew that Reverend Michaels had lost his wife 30 years ago and still talked to her every morning, knew that Harold Brennan's hands hurt so badly some days he could barely hold a hammer, but he came to work anyway because the alternative was giving up. Knew that Tommy dreamed of owning his own stable someday, a real one, where he was the boss and could make all the decisions. She knew the Pritchards, knew the specific way Sarah's face tightened when she was worried, knew the sound of Daniel's laugh on the rare occasions when he forgot to be stressed, knew that Emma fell asleep reading under her blankets with a lamp that her parents pretended not to know about. These were her people now, whether she'd planned for it or not. And maybe that was worth more than a horse, more than mobility, more than the freedom to run when things got hard. Saturday dawned clear and cold. People started arriving around noon, ranchers from neighboring spreads, families from towns up and down the rail line, even a few curious travelers who'd heard about the auction and wanted to see what the fuss was about. The churchyard filled with wagons and horses, and Reverend Michaels set up a podium in front of the building where he could call out the bids. Callie had spent the morning grooming Rusty until he shone, braiding his mane and tail, cleaning his hooves, making him look as good as he possibly could. The gelding seemed to sense something was happening, kept nuzzling her shoulder like he was offering comfort or maybe asking for it. "You're going to be fine," she told him, knowing horses didn't understand words but maybe understanding tone. "You're going to go to someone who'll take good care of you, someone who needs you more than I do." She wasn't sure if that last part was true, but she said it anyway. The auction started with the smaller items. Mrs. Henderson's quilt went for $12 to a rancher's wife who admired the stitching. The preserves sold for $1 a jar. The lumber went for $15. Harold's carpentry services fetched $20. Slowly, steadily, the total climbed. $50, $75, $100. The Pritchards stood off to the side, watching with expressions that wavered between hope and disbelief. Emma held her mother's hand tightly, and Daniel leaned on his crutch with his jaw set in that particular way of men trying not to show emotion. Then it was time for Rusty. Callie led him to the center of the yard, and Reverend Michaels described his qualities: steady temperament, good feet, strong back, reliable in all weather. A working horse, not fancy but dependable. "We'll start the bidding at $25, the Reverend said. A rancher in the back raised his hand. "25, 30, said another. 35, 40. The numbers climbed, and Callie felt her throat getting tighter. She kept her hand on Rusty's neck, feeling his warmth, his steady heartbeat, the particular way he leaned into her touch. 75, someone called. 80, 90. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing something in the moment, understanding that this wasn't just about a horse. This was about a woman giving up the last thing of value she owned to save neighbors she'd known for less than a month. $100, said a voice from the back. Callie looked up and saw Samuel Garrett, the banker, his face unreadable. The crowd went silent. $100, More than Rusty was worth as a simple working horse, but Garrett had to know that. Had to understand what he was doing. 100 going once, Reverend Michaels called. Going twice, 150, another voice interrupted. Harold Brennan stepped forward, his twisted hands shaking, but his voice steady. Garrett looked at him with cold calculation. 175. The air felt thick with tension. Harold couldn't outbid Garrett, everyone knew that. The banker had more money than anyone else in town, but then Martha spoke up. 200! Garrett's expression flickered with annoyance. 225. 250, said Mrs. Henderson. 275, said Mrs. Fletcher, and suddenly Callie understood. They weren't bidding to buy Rusty. They were bidding to keep Garrett from getting him, to drive the price so high that even a banker would balk. Garrett looked around at the determined faces, at the community that had closed ranks against him. His mouth tightened. $300, he said flatly. The silence was absolute. $300, exactly what the Pritchards needed. Exactly what Garrett had to know they needed. Reverend Michaels looked at the crowd, waiting. No one spoke. $300 going once, he said. Going twice. $350, Harold said quietly. Garrett stared at him. You don't have that kind of money. We do. Martha stepped forward, holding a cloth bag. Everyone here contributed. We have $350 right here, and we're bidding it on Callie's horse. All of it, the crowd murmured in agreement. This was beyond rationality now, beyond good business sense. This was about principle, about standing together, about showing that some things mattered more than money. Garrett looked at them all with something that might have been respect, or might have been anger. Fine, he said. You win. He's yours. He turned and walked away, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Callie stood in the churchyard, stunned, while people surged around her, offering congratulations and support. The math didn't make sense. They'd bid $350 on Rusty, but they needed that money for the Pritchards. Unless... Martha appeared at her elbow, pressing the cloth bag into her hands. Count it, she said. Callie opened the bag with trembling fingers. Inside were bills and coins, carefully counted and stacked. She did the arithmetic twice, unable to believe what she was seeing. $650. How? She started. People gave more than we asked, Reverend Michaels explained, his eyes bright. When they heard about the auction, about what you were doing, they wanted to help. Some gave $1, some gave 10, some gave 50. It added up. But you bid $350 on Rusty, which means, Martha interrupted, smiling, that after paying the Pritchards' mortgage debt, we have $350 left over, and the town has decided that money belongs to you, for Rusty, so you can keep your horse. Callie felt her knees go weak. She sat down hard on the church steps, still holding the bag, still trying to process what had happened. They'd raised enough money to save the Pritchards and let her keep Rusty. Somehow, impossibly, everyone had won. Emma came running over, her face flushed with excitement. Did you hear? We get to keep the farm. And you get to keep Rusty. Behind her, Daniel and Sarah approached more slowly. Daniel's eyes were wet, and he didn't seem to care who saw. Miss Monroe, he said, his voice rough. I don't have words for... Don't need words, Callie managed, standing up on unsteady legs. Just promise me something. Anything. Promise you'll let people help when you need it. Promise you won't try to do everything alone. Daniel nodded, unable to speak. Sarah stepped forward and hugged Callie tightly, and Emma joined in. And suddenly Callie was surrounded by a family that wasn't hers, but somehow was. The celebration continued into the evening. Someone brought out a fiddle, someone else produced whiskey, and the churchyard transformed into something approaching a party. Callie found herself swept along, accepting thanks from people she barely knew, being clapped on the shoulder by ranchers and squeezed by widow women who smelled like lavender and baking bread. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. This was what community felt like, what belonging felt like, and she'd forgotten how good and how frightening it could be to matter to people. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Callie walked to where Rusty was tied, needing a moment alone with him. Rava trotted along at her heels, and when Callie leaned against Rusty's warm shoulder, the puppy sat down and leaned against her leg. "You're staying with me, boy," she told the horse. "We're both staying." "That was quite something you did today." Callie turned to find Samuel Garrett standing a few feet away, his expression no longer cold but thoughtful. "Mr. Garrett," she said warily. "I want you to know," he said, "that I bid on your horse because I respect what you were trying to do. Not to sabotage you." "Could have fooled me," Callie said, not bothering to hide her skepticism. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I run a business, Miss Monroe. Businesses require difficult decisions." "But," he paused, choosing words carefully, "but I'm not a monster." "And watching this town come together today, watching what you organized, it made me think about what I'm doing here. Whether I'm part of this community or just extracting value from it." Callie studied him, trying to decide if he was sincere or just making excuses. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm going to restructure the Pritchards' loan. Lower interest rate, longer repayment term. Give them a real chance to succeed." He met her eyes. "And I'm saying you should consider applying for the town clerk position. It just opened up, and you've proven you can organize people, get things done. Pays $50 a month plus housing." Callie's mind reeled. $50 a month was more than she made at the lumber yard. "And housing, actual housing, not a stable stall. Why?" she asked bluntly. "Because Ashford is dying," Garrett said simply. "Because people like you are what might save it. Because I'm tired of being the villain in a story where everyone loses." He tipped his hat. "Think about it, Miss Monroe. The town needs someone like you." He walked away, leaving Callie standing in the twilight with a puppy, a horse, and a job offer she'd never expected. That night, after everyone had gone home and the churchyard had returned to quiet, Callie sat on the steps with Reverend Michaels. Brava was asleep on her lap, and the stars were coming out in a sky so clear it looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. "Town clerk," she said. "I don't know anything about being a town clerk." "You'd learn," the Reverend said. "You're smart, organized, good with people. That's most of what the job requires. And the rest? Patience, understanding, the ability to care about small things, permits and records and minutes from meetings, because they matter to someone." Callie thought about the past month, about finding Brava, about the Pritchards, about fixing the church roof and organizing the auction. Small things that had added up to something larger. Small acts of caring that had somehow transformed her from a drifter into someone who mattered. "I think I might want to do it," she said quietly. "Then you should," the Reverend smiled. "You know what I've learned in my 73 years. The moments when we choose to stay instead of run, to help instead of walk past, to care instead of remain indifferent, those are the moments that define us, that make us who we are meant to be." Callie looked down at Brava, at the small creature who'd somehow pulled her back from the edge of something. She thought about Thomas, about how he'd always chosen connection over self-protection, kindness over practicality. She'd spent 3 years running from his example because following it hurt too much. But maybe running hurt more. Maybe loneliness was the sharper edge. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Reverend Michaels said. "Means you're paying attention. Means you understand what you're choosing. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Miss Monroe. It's doing the thing anyway." The moon rose, fat and golden, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. Brava stirred in Callie's lap but didn't wake. The puppy trusted her completely, had trusted her from that first moment on the bench. And maybe that trust was teaching Callie how to trust herself again. But the evening's revelations weren't finished. Monday morning, when Callie arrived at the lumberyard for work, Harold Brennan was waiting with a strange expression on his face. "Got something to tell you," he said without preamble. "Might change some things." Callie's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "Your horse, Rusty. I recognized him on Saturday but wasn't sure until I checked." Harold pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, a bill of sale, yellowed with age. "That horse used to belong to my brother, Robert. He died 8 years ago, left me everything he owned, including that gelding. I sold him to a ranch up in Montana 5 years back when I needed money." Callie stared at the paper, not understanding. So I'm the original owner, which means when that ranch gave him to you, They were giving away a horse that technically still belonged to my family line. Harold folded the paper carefully. Now, I could make trouble about that. Could say he was sold under false pretenses. But I'm not going to. I don't understand, Callie said. Harold smiled, and it transformed his weathered face. I'm giving you the paperwork. Clear title. That horse is yours legally and completely. No questions, no debts. Just wanted you to know. Callie felt tears prick her eyes. Why? Because you gave him up to save a family you barely knew. Because you've brought life back to this town in a month that we'd been missing for years. Because, he paused, emotion thick in his voice. Because my brother would have liked you. He was always helping strays, too. He pressed the paper into her hands and walked away before she could thank him, leaving her standing in the lumberyard with a clear title to a horse she'd thought she'd lost and found again in the same day. That afternoon, Callie rode out to the Pritchard farm one more time. She needed to tell them about the town clerk position, needed to see Emma's face and Daniel's relief and Sarah's smile. But when she arrived, she found them in the yard with another visitor, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and elegant clothes that seemed out of place on a struggling farm. Callie, Emma called, running over. This is my Aunt Margaret. She's Mama's sister from back east. Margaret turned to look at Callie, and her expression was assessing but not unkind. So you're the one who organized the auction. Sarah's told me all about you. Yes, ma'am, Callie said, suddenly conscious of her worn work clothes and dusty boots. I've come to help, Margaret announced. Should have come months ago when I heard about Daniel's accident, but I thought... She stopped, her composed expression cracking slightly. I thought they'd ask if they needed help. Pride runs deep in this family. But hearing about what you did, about the whole town coming together, it made me realize that waiting to be asked is just another form of abandoning people. Sarah stepped forward, taking her sister's hand. Margaret's going to stay for a few months. Help us get caught up. Maybe invest a little in some improvements we've been putting off. More than a little, Margaret corrected. I'm a widow with more money than I need and no children to leave it to. Family should help family. I should have learned that lesson years ago. Callie looked at the four of them, Daniel standing straighter now that hope had returned, Sarah with color back in her cheeks, Emma practically vibrating with excitement, and Margaret trying to maintain dignity while clearly emotional about reuniting with her sister. Sometimes, Callie said, the best lessons are the ones we learn late. Better late than never. That evening, riding back to town with Brava in front of her and the sun painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Callie felt something settle in her chest. Not happiness exactly. She wasn't sure she remembered what happiness felt like. But something close. Something like peace. Something like the beginning of home. She'd come to Ashford with nothing but desperation and loneliness. She'd found a puppy that needed help, and in helping her, had discovered a whole community of people who needed each other. She'd been given a horse, lost him, and gotten him back again. She'd been offered a job, a home, a place to belong, and maybe, just maybe, she'd found something even more valuable. She'd found a reason to stay. The town clerk's office occupied 2 rooms above the general store, accessed by a narrow staircase that smelled of coffee and old paper. When Martha showed Callie the space, it was covered in dust and filled with filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in months. Maybe years. Previous clerk was old Mr. Morrison, Martha explained, running her finger along a desk and leaving a trail in the dust. Died last spring. We've been managing without, but there's work that needs doing. Land records to update, permits to file, meetings to document. Boring work mostly, but necessary. The rooms were modest but solid. One served as the office, with the desk and filing cabinets and a potbelly stove for heat. The other was smaller, barely big enough for a bed and a trunk, but it had a window that looked out over Main Street and caught the morning sun. After months of sleeping in a stable, it looked like luxury. I'll take it, Callie said. She moved in that weekend with help from Tommy, who seemed thrilled to have his stable back to himself, though he made Callie promise to visit Rusty regularly. Harold gave her an old bed frame from his storage, and Martha contributed linens that smelled like the cedar chest they'd been stored in. Mrs. Henderson brought curtains, and Mrs. Fletcher arrived with a pot of stew that she said was too much for one person, but perfect for someone settling into a new home. By Sunday evening, Callie had a home, an actual home, with a door that locked, and a bed that didn't smell like horse, and a window she could look out while drinking morning coffee. Brava seemed to approve, sniffing every corner before curling up on a rug by the stove with a contented sigh. The work started Monday. Callie discovered that town clerk was less boring than Martha had suggested and more overwhelming. There were property deeds dating back 40 years that needed cataloguing, water rights disputes that required diplomatic handling, and a backlog of permit requests from people who'd given up waiting months ago. She threw herself into the work with the same determination she'd brought to ranch labor. She taught herself the filing system, learned the peculiar language of legal documents, and began the slow process of bringing order to chaos. Reverend Michaels helped, teaching her the history behind various records and explaining the relationships between families that weren't obvious. From names alone, you need to understand the people behind the paperwork, he told her one afternoon while they sorted through marriage records. See this entry here. Joshua Brennan married Mary Fletcher in 1873. That's Harold's parents and Mrs. Fletcher's husband's grandparents. Everyone in this town is connected in some way. That's why community matters. Hurt one person, you're hurting their cousins and in-laws and childhood friends. Callie thought about that while she worked. Every document she filed, every record she updated, represented people. Their hopes, their struggles, their attempts to build something lasting in an uncertain world. It made the work feel important in a way that fence mending and lumber hauling never had. Not more important, just different. Both kinds of work mattered. In the evenings, she'd walk through town with Brava, watching the puppy grow more confident and playful with each passing day. Brava had lost her fearful trembling and now greeted everyone with tail-wagging enthusiasm. She learned to sit and stay and come when called, and she shadowed Callie everywhere with devoted attention. Tommy had been right. She was going to be a good dog. Smart and loyal, the two things that mattered most. 3 weeks into her new job, Callie received a letter. It was addressed to her in care of the general store, forwarded from her parents' address in Arizona. The return address was a law office in Billings, Montana. She opened it with hands that trembled slightly, unsure what to expect. The letter was brief and formal. It informed her that the estate of Jonathan Reeves had been settled, and as per Mr. Reeves's will, she was entitled to a bequest. Mr. Reeves had specified that Callie Monroe, formerly employed at his ranch, should receive a sum of $500 in recognition of her excellent work and steadfast character. Callie sat down hard, the letter crumpling in her grip. Jonathan Reeves. She remembered him, the old rancher she'd worked for 2 years ago. He'd been gruff but fair, the kind of man who paid on time and didn't ask questions about why a woman was doing a man's job. She'd worked for him for 6 months before he let her go when the work dried up. She'd had no idea he'd thought enough of her to leave her money in his will. $500. Combined with what she'd saved from her clerk's salary, it was more money than she'd had in years. Enough to buy land, maybe. Enough to build something instead of just surviving day to day. The possibilities made her dizzy. She showed the letter to Reverend Michaels the next Sunday after service. He read it carefully, then handed it back with a thoughtful expression. "That's quite a gift," he said. "Mr. Reeves must have thought highly of you." "I barely knew him," Callie said. "Worked for him 6 months, kept my head down, did my job. Sometimes that's all it takes. Being reliable, being steady, being someone a person can count on." The Reverend smiled. "What will you do with it?" "I don't know yet." But even as she said it, an idea was forming. Maybe I could buy a piece of land. Start something. Like what? Callie thought about the strays she'd placed in homes, about Brava and the other puppies, about all the abandoned animals she'd seen in her years of drifting. A place for animals that need help. Dogs mostly, but maybe horses too. Ones that are too old to work or too broken to sell. Give them somewhere to live out their days. The Reverend's eyes lit up. A sanctuary. I don't know if that's too grand a word for it. But yeah, something like that. That's a fine dream, Miss Monroe. A very fine dream indeed. Over the next weeks, Callie began making inquiries. There was land for sale on the outskirts of Ashford, 20 acres that included a small cabin and a barn that needed work. The owner was asking $300, negotiable. It was raw land, would require significant labor to make functional, but it had water access and decent grazing. She walked the property on a cold November afternoon, Brava racing ahead to investigate every smell and shadow. The cabin was small but sturdy, and the barn just needed a new roof and some wall repairs. The land rolled gently, covered in dried grass that would green up come spring. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from town, and further out the mountains that promised something beyond the immediate horizon. She could build something here, not just for herself but for others. A place where old dogs could rest and traumatized horses could heal. A place that said broken things still had value, still deserved care. The decision should have been difficult, but it wasn't. Standing on that land with Brava at her feet and the wind in her face, Callie felt something she hadn't felt since before Thomas died. Certainty. This was right. This was what she was meant to do. She made an offer the next day. The owner accepted. By the end of November, she owned 20 acres of Wyoming territory and had started making plans. But even as she moved forward with the land purchase, she found herself thinking about Thomas more and more. About conversations they'd had, about the dreams he'd shared, about the life he'd never gotten to live. The grief that had been a constant weight for 3 years hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something different. Something that felt less like a burden and more like a connection, a thread linking her to the person he'd been and the values he'd held. She decided it was time to visit his grave. The cemetery was on the north edge of her parents' old property, now owned by strangers. Callie rode out on a Saturday morning, Brava trotting alongside Rusty. The day was clear and cold, the kind of weather where your breath came out in clouds and your fingers numbed inside gloves. She found his marker easily, a simple stone with his name and dates and the words, "Beloved son and brother," carved below. Someone had been tending it, probably her parents during one of their visits back from Arizona. There were no weeds, and someone had placed a small bouquet of dried wildflowers in a jar. Callie dismounted and stood looking at the stone, Brava sitting quietly at her side. She hadn't known what she'd say when she got here, hadn't planned any grand speech, but standing in front of his grave, the words came naturally. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," she said quietly. "I was angry for a long time. Angry at you for dying, angry at God for taking you, angry at myself for not being there fast enough to help. But mostly I was scared. Scared that if I let myself feel how much I missed you, I'd never be able to function again." A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp in the cold air. "I found a dog," Callie continued. "Actually, she kind of found me. Little scrappy thing that someone abandoned. Made me think of you and all those strays you used to bring home. I named her Brava, after Grandma. You'd like her." Brava's tail thumped against the ground, as if she knew she was being discussed. "I'm staying in Ashford. Got a job as town clerk, bought some land. Going to build a sanctuary for animals that need help." Callie's voice thickened with emotion. "It's what you would have done if you'd lived. So I guess I'm doing it for both of us." The wind picked up, rattling the dried grass and making the wildflowers in the jar dance. Callie stood there for a long time, not saying anything more, just being present with her grief and her memories and the strange peace that came from finally acknowledging both. Before she left, she placed her hand on the cold stone. "I love you," she said, "and I'm going to try to live the way you did, caring about things that need caring for. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Riding back to town, Callie felt lighter than she had in years. The grief wasn't gone, would probably never be completely gone, but it had become something she could carry without it crushing her. Thomas's death had broken something in her, but maybe finding Brava had started the process of putting those broken pieces back together in a new arrangement. Not the same as before, but whole in its own way. The sun was setting when she reached Ashford, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. She stopped at the general store to pick up supplies, and found Martha closing up for the evening. "Heard you bought the Peterson place," Martha said, tallying Callie's purchases. "Planning to start your animal sanctuary?" "Word travels fast," Callie observed. "Only thing that does in this town," Martha said with a slight smile. "For what it's worth, I think it's a good idea. Place like that is needed. You think people will support it? People supported you saving the Pritchards' farm. They'll support this too." Martha handed over the supplies. "You've proven yourself, Callie. This town's lucky to have you." The words settled warm in Callie's chest as she climbed the stairs to her rooms above the store. Brava bounded ahead, eager for dinner and the evening routine they'd established. Callie lit the lamp and started a fire in the stove, and as warmth filled the small space, she thought about how much had changed in just 2 months. She'd arrived in Ashford with nothing, no money, no home, no purpose beyond survival. She'd found a puppy that needed her, and in helping that puppy, she'd found a whole community that needed each other. She'd discovered that running from grief only made it follow you, but facing it, really facing it, could transform it into something you could live with. And now she was building something, not just a sanctuary for animals, but a life. A real life with roots and connections and responsibilities. The kind of life Thomas would have been proud of. Brava curled up at her feet while she ate dinner, and Callie reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "You ready for this?" she asked. "Ready to help a bunch of other strays like you?" Brava's tail thumped in response, and Callie smiled. Ready or not, they were doing this. Together. The first snow fell in early December, transforming Ashford into something from a picture book. White roofs, frosted windows, smoke rising from chimneys into a pearl-grey sky. Callie woke to find Brava at the window, watching snowflakes fall with fascinated intensity. The dog had never seen snow before, and when Callie let her outside, Brava bounded through the powder with pure joy, snapping at flakes and rolling on her back. It was a Saturday, which meant no town clerk duties, and Callie had planned to spend the day at her new property, starting work on the barn roof before winter set in completely. But when she walked down to the stable to get Rusty, she found Tommy in the yard, his face pale and frightened. "Miss Callie," he said, the words tumbling out fast. "It's the Pritchards. Something's wrong. Emma rode into town an hour ago looking for you. Said her pa's taken bad. Fever and chills, can't hardly breathe. Her ma's scared he's got pneumonia." Callie's stomach dropped. Pneumonia killed people, especially in winter when doctors were far away and medicine was expensive. "Where's Emma now?" "She's at the doctor's office trying to get him to come out. But Dr. Hayward says he can't make the trip in this weather. Roads are too bad. He gave her some medicine to take back, but Emma doesn't know if it's enough." Callie didn't hesitate. "Saddle Rusty. I'm going out there. In this weather." "Miss Callie, Tommy's right about the roads. Then I'll go slow." She was already moving, gathering supplies, blankets, food, the medicine Dr. Hayward had given Emma. "You tell Reverend Michaels what's happening. Tell Martha. If I'm not back by tomorrow evening, send someone." The ride out to the Pritchard farm took twice as long as normal. The snow was coming down harder now, thick flakes that obscured vision and made Rusty's footing treacherous. But the horse was steady, picking his way carefully through drifts that were already knee-deep in places. Brava struggled through the snow, her short legs working hard to keep up. Callie finally stopped and tucked the dog inside her coat, where Brava curled up against her chest, shivering but determined. When they finally reached the farm, Callie could see smoke rising from the chimney, a good sign. Meant someone was keeping the fires going. She dismounted and tied Rusty under a shelter, then hurried to the house with Brava, still tucked in her coat. Emma opened the door before she could knock, her face streaked with tears. "You came," she said, the relief in her voice heartbreaking. "I didn't know if you'd be able to—" "Where is he?" Callie asked, stepping inside and shaking snow from her coat. "Bedroom." "He's bad, Miss Callie. Real bad." The house was warm, but carried the smell of sickness, sweat and fever and fear. Sarah sat beside the bed where Daniel lay, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored and wet-sounding. When he exhaled, his whole body shook with the effort. "Daniel," Callie said quietly, moving to the bedside. His eyes opened, but she wasn't sure he recognized her. The fever had him in its grip. "I don't know what to do," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "The medicine Dr. Hayward sent, I gave him some, but I don't know if it's right, don't know if I'm doing enough." "Show me," Callie said, and Sarah handed her the bottle with shaking hands. Callie read the label: laudanum for pain, camphor for breathing. Standard treatment, but Daniel needed more. He needed his fever broken, needed fluids, needed constant attention. "All right," Callie said, taking charge because someone had to. "Sarah, I need you to boil water. Emma, get me clean cloths and a basin. We're going to bring this fever down, and we're going to make sure he keeps breathing." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Callie stayed at Daniel's bedside, sponging his burning skin with cool water, helping him sip willowbark tea when he could swallow, monitoring his breathing for any sign it was worsening. Sarah and Emma kept the fires going, brought food and water, supported each other when fear threatened to overwhelm them. The aunt, Margaret, appeared around dinner time, having made her way from her hotel in town through the snow. She brought more medicine, proper medical supplies, and most importantly, another pair of capable hands. "I was a nurse during the war," she told Callie quietly. "I know what pneumonia looks like. He's fighting hard, but it could go either way." Night fell and the snow continued. Callie sent Emma to bed, but the girl refused to leave, curling up in a chair in the corner where she could watch her father. Rava stayed with her, offering what comfort a small dog could provide. Daniel's fever peaked around midnight. He was delirious, calling out for people who weren't there, thrashing weakly against the blankets. Callie held his hand and spoke to him steadily, not sure if he could hear, but needing to provide some anchor to reality. "You're going to be all right," she told him, though she wasn't certain it was true. "Your family needs you. Emma needs her father. You're going to fight this and win." Sarah stood on the other side of the bed, her own hand covering Daniel's, her lips moving in silent prayer. At some point in the darkest hours before dawn, Daniel's fever broke. The dangerous flush faded from his cheeks. His breathing eased slightly, and when Callie checked his pulse, it was slower, steadier. He opened his eyes, really opened them this time, seeing her, and managed a weak smile. "You came?" he whispered hoarsely. "Of course I came," Callie said, relief making her voice rough. "We're family." "That's what family does." His hand squeezed hers weakly. And then he slipped into real sleep. Not the fever-tossed delirium he'd been trapped in, but genuine restorative rest. Sarah collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "He's going to be all right," she said wonderingly. "He's really going to be all right." Emma had fallen asleep in her corner chair, exhausted from worry and fear. Margaret gently draped a blanket over the girl, then joined Callie by the window. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, and the world was silent and white and perfect. "You saved his life," Margaret said quietly. "We all did," Callie corrected. "No one does this alone." As dawn broke over the snowy landscape, Callie stood at the window with Brava in her arms, watching the sun paint the world in shades of rose and gold. She thought about all the ways she'd arrived here. The puppy tied to a bench, the community that had come together, the choice to stay instead of run. She thought about Thomas, who had always believed that caring mattered more than caution. And she thought about herself, about the woman she'd been 2 months ago and the woman she was becoming. Outside, Rusty nickered softly from his shelter. The farm was quiet, except for the peaceful sounds of sleeping, Daniel resting, Emma curled in her chair, Sarah dozing with her head on the edge of the bed. Callie had saved a life tonight, had been part of saving it anyway, and in doing so, she'd discovered something important. She wasn't broken anymore. Or maybe she was, but broken in a way that had made her stronger, more capable of understanding other people's pain because she'd survived her own. The sun cleared the horizon, brilliant against the snow, and Callie felt ready for whatever came next. Daniel recovered slowly over the following week. Callie stayed at the farm during that time, sleeping on the couch and helping Sarah manage the household while Daniel regained his strength. Margaret proved invaluable, her nursing experience guiding them through the recovery process with competence and calm. On the third day, when Daniel was strong enough to sit up and eat real food, he called Callie to his bedside. His face was gaunt, his body weakened, but his eyes were clear. "I need to thank you properly," he said. "For coming out in that storm, for staying, for—" "You don't need to thank me," Callie interrupted gently. "I told you before. We're family, but we're not," Daniel said. "Not really. You've only known us a couple months. You didn't have any obligation." "Family's not about obligation," Callie said, echoing words Reverend Michaels had spoken to her. "It's about choosing to show up, about caring even when it's inconvenient or difficult. You'd have done the same for me." Daniel's eyes grew wet. "I would. And I will, if you ever need it." Emma appeared in the doorway, Bravar at her heels. The girl had barely left the house since her father fell ill, had spent hours sitting beside his bed, reading to him, or just holding his hand. Now she looked lighter, the fear that had shadowed her face finally lifting. "Pa's getting better," she said to Callie, stating the obvious but needing to say it anyway. "He's really getting better." "He is," Callie agreed. "Thanks to you riding into town for help." "That was brave, Emma. Really brave." The girl blushed with pride. And Callie saw Thomas in that moment, saw the way her brother had looked when their father praised him, the particular joy of being recognized for doing something difficult and necessary. By the end of the week, Daniel was walking short distances with a cane, and Callie felt comfortable returning to town. The roads had been cleared by then, packed down by wagons and horses until they were passable again. She rode back with Bravar and Rusty, feeling the weight of exhaustion, but also satisfaction. She'd been tested and hadn't broken, had faced a crisis and risen to meet it. Ashford welcomed her back with the quiet warmth she'd come to expect. Tommy was relieved to see her. Martha had saved her mail, and Reverend Michaels stopped by that evening to hear the full story. "The whole town's been worried," he said, settling into the chair by her stove. "News travels even in winter. They're saying you rode out in a blizzard to save Daniel Pritchard's life." "I didn't save his life alone," Callie said. "Sarah and Margaret and Emma all helped. And Daniel himself, he's a fighter. Still," the Reverend said, "you could have stayed in town where it was safe. No one would have blamed you." Callie thought about that. 2 months ago, she would have stayed in town. Would have told herself it wasn't her problem, that getting involved would only lead to more pain. But something had shifted when she found Bravar on that bench. Or maybe the shift had started before, had been building through 3 years of loneliness until one small puppy's eyes had finally broken through her defenses. "I'm not that person anymore," she said quietly. "The one who walks away. I don't know exactly when I stopped being her, but I did," the Reverend smiled. "I know exactly when. The moment you decided to untie that puppy instead of walking past. Everything else followed from that choice. Christmas came, and with it the first real celebration Ashford had seen in years. The church was decorated with pine branches and candles, and families who hadn't gathered together in months came out for the service. Callie sat with the Pritchards, who'd insisted she join them, and felt the warmth of genuine belonging settle over her shoulders like a blanket. After the service, there was a community dinner in the church hall. Tables groaned with food that families had contributed: roasted chickens, fresh bread, pies made with preserved fruit, vegetables from root cellars. It wasn't fancy, but it was abundant in the way that mattered most. Abundant in care, in effort, in the desire to share what you had with others. Callie found herself at a table with Harold Brennan, Martha, Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Fletcher, and Tommy. They were talking about spring plans, about who needed help with planting, about whether the winter would be long or short. Ordinary conversation, the kind that happened around tables everywhere, but it felt extraordinary to Callie because she was part of it. Not an outsider looking in, but someone who belonged. Emma brought Bravar over, the puppy wearing a red ribbon around her neck that Sarah had tied on that morning. "Can she have some turkey scraps?" Emma asked. "Just a little," Callie said, smiling. "Don't want her getting sick." She watched Emma feed Brava small pieces of meat, watched the careful way the girl's hands moved, gentle and patient. Emma would make a good rancher someday, Callie thought. Would take care of the land and the animals with the same dedication she'd shown caring for her father. The evening wound down slowly. Families drifting home through the cold night, but Callie stayed to help clean up. She washed dishes alongside Martha, while Reverend Michaels swept the floor and Tommy stacked chairs. It was domestic work, unremarkable, but it felt significant in its ordinariness. This was what community looked like, not just the big moments of crisis and celebration, but the small acts of helping that made daily life possible. Walking back to her rooms, above the general store, Brava trotting beside her and stars brilliant in the clear winter sky, Callie thought about the year that was ending. She'd started it alone and adrift, moving from place to place with no anchor and no purpose beyond survival. She was ending it with a home, a job, land she owned, plans for the future, and people who cared whether she lived or died, all because of a puppy tied to a bench. All because she'd chosen to stop instead of walking past. Inside her rooms, Callie lit the lamp and built up the fire. Brava settled on her rug with a contented sigh, and Callie sat at her desk with paper and pen. She'd been avoiding this for too long, but tonight felt right. She began to write, "Dear Thomas, I know you can't read this, but I need to tell you anyway. I'm okay now, more than okay. I found my way back to living, not just surviving. Found it in a little town you never heard of, with people you never met, doing work you'd probably laugh at. But I think you'd be proud anyway. I think you'd understand. I'm building something good here, something that would make you smile. Thank you for teaching me how to care, even though it hurt to learn. Love always, Callie." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the desk drawer. Maybe someday she'd take it to his grave and leave it there. Or maybe she'd keep it here, a promise written down and witnessed by no one but herself and a sleeping dog. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Tomorrow she'd start work on the sanctuary barn. Tomorrow she'd file more paperwork and help more neighbors and continue building the life she'd stumbled into. But tonight, she simply sat by the fire with Brava and felt at peace with where she was and who she'd become. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed everything. The snow melted into rushing creeks. The brown grass turned green almost overnight, and wildflowers painted the hills in colors that seemed impossible after months of white and gray. Callie stood in the doorway of her newly repaired barn, watching Brava, now fully grown and no longer a trembling puppy, race across the pasture with the pure joy of a creature who'd found her place in the world. The sanctuary had 3 residents besides Brava. There was an old mare named Daisy, Emma's mother dog, who'd been moved here when she could no longer navigate the farm, sleeping peacefully in a stall lined with fresh straw. There was a 3-legged hound that Mrs. Fletcher had found abandoned on the road, now contentedly sunning himself on the porch. And there was a blind mule that Harold Brennan had given her, too old to work, but deserving of care nonetheless. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. A place where broken things could heal, or at least rest. A place that said value wasn't measured in productivity or perfection. Callie had hung a sign over the barn door, hand-carved by Tommy during the winter months. It read simply, "Brava's Haven, a sanctuary for souls who need one." The name had been Emma's suggestion, and it felt right. Brava had been the first soul to find sanctuary here, even before the land was bought or the barn repaired. It seemed fitting that the place should carry her name. The town had embraced the sanctuary in ways that surprised Callie. People donated time and materials, helped with repairs, spread word to neighboring communities about what she was doing. The Pritchards sent hay and feed. Martha organized a donation system where townspeople could contribute money or supplies. Even Samuel Garrett had contributed, though he did so anonymously. Callie only knew because Reverend Michaels let it slip one Sunday after service. On this particular spring morning, Callie was expecting visitors. She'd received a letter 2 weeks ago from her parents saying they wanted to come see her, see this town she'd written about, meet the people who'd become her family. The prospect made her nervous in a way she hadn't expected. Her parents represented her old life, the one before Thomas died and everything fell apart. Would they understand this new version of her? Would they recognize their daughter in the woman she'd become? She heard the wagon before she saw it, wheels crunching on the gravel road, the sound of horses and human voices. Brava barked once, alerting her, then wagged her tail as the wagon came into view. Her parents looked older than Callie remembered, smaller somehow, but their faces lit up when they saw her. Her mother climbed down from the wagon with more energy than a woman her age should possess. And suddenly Callie was being hugged with the fierce strength of maternal love. "Let me look at you," her mother said, pulling back and holding Callie at arm's length. "You look good, sweetheart. You look healthy. Happy even." "I am," Callie said, and realized with some surprise that it was true. Not just content or managing, but genuinely happy. "Come on, let me show you around." She gave them the tour, the barn with its residents, the small cabin she'd built with help from half the town, the pastures where she planned to expand. Her father asked practical questions about water access and feed costs, while her mother simply watched Callie's face. Seeing something there that made her smile, they went into town for lunch at the general store's small restaurant. Martha made a fuss over Callie's parents, and soon they were surrounded by people Callie had written about in her letters: Reverend Michaels, Harold Brennan, Tommy, Mrs. Henderson. The Pritchards came too, bringing Emma, who'd grown another inch over winter, and was talking about maybe becoming a veterinarian someday, sitting at that crowded table, listening to her parents laugh at Tommy's stories, and watching her mother hold Brava in her lap like she was the most precious thing in the world. Callie felt the last piece of something broken slide back into place. Later, after her parents had retired to the hotel for the evening, Callie sat on the bench outside the old post office. The same bench where she'd found Brava 6 months ago. It had been cleaned up since then, given a fresh coat of paint by the town council, but it was still the same bench. Still the place where everything had changed. Emma appeared from somewhere, the way she often did, and sat down beside her. The girl had taken to visiting the sanctuary most afternoons after school, helping with chores and learning how to care for animals that needed gentleness and patience. "Your parents seem nice," Emma said. "Your ma's funny." "She is," Callie agreed. "I'd forgotten that about her. Do you think they'll visit again?" "I hope so." And she did. For the first time in years, the thought of her parents visiting didn't fill her with anxiety or guilt. She'd found a way to honor Thomas's memory without being consumed by grief, had learned that moving forward wasn't the same as leaving him behind. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the buildings gold. Brava appeared from wherever she'd been exploring and climbed onto Callie's lap, even though she was far too big to be a lapdog now. Callie didn't complain, just wrapped her arms around the dog and rested her chin on Brava's head. "Miss Callie," Emma said after a while. "Thank you." "For what?" "For staying. For not being like everyone else who passes through and leaves. For making me believe that good things can still happen." Callie felt her throat tighten. "You helped me believe that too, you know. You and your family. You and everyone here." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Callie thought about the journey that had brought her here, about loss and loneliness and the long years of drifting, about a puppy tied to a bench and the choice to stop instead of walking past, about community and belonging and the courage it took to care about things that could hurt you. She thought about Thomas, about the legacy of kindness he'd left behind, about how love didn't end when someone died. It just changed form, became something you carried forward and shared with others. The town clock chimed the hour, and Emma stood up, needing to get home before full dark. "See you tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Callie confirmed. She sat there a while longer, Brava warm and solid in her arms, watching lights come on in windows across the town. Her town now, her home. The place where she'd learned that broken things could heal, that lonely people could find family, that sometimes the smallest creatures led you exactly where you needed to be. Brava sighed contentedly, and Callie scratched behind her ears. "You ready to go home, girl?" The dog's tail thumped agreement, and together they walked back to the sanctuary, to the barn where old souls rested, to the cabin where a lamp burned in the window, to the life Callie had built from nothing but need and stubbornness and one small act of kindness. Sometimes the smallest creatures find us when we need them most. Sometimes a weathered cowhand with empty pockets discovers that love comes when we're broken enough to let it in. Sometimes a puppy tied to a bench becomes the beginning of everything. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you find your way home.